in the glittering ballrooms of Dubai's most exclusive hotels, where crystal chandeliers reflect 1,000 dreams and designer gowns sweep across marble floors. Some of the world's most powerful couples maintain perfect facades, but behind the diamond necklaces and practiced smiles, real hearts beat with real pain. This is the story of Margaret Sullivan, a 62-year-old former librarian from Portland, Oregon, who married Rashid Al-Mansouri, one of the Middle East's wealthiest real estate developers, only to find herself slowly becoming invisible in her own marriage. For 3 years, she had transformed herself into the perfect corporate wife, learning Arabic, studying Middle Eastern customs, hosting impeccable charity galas, and supporting her husband's empire building with quiet grace. Yet with each passing month, Rashid seemed to look through her rather than at her, his attention consumed by business deals, international investors, and the endless social obligations that came with his status. At his nephew's lavish wedding in the heart of Dubai, surrounded by 1,000 guests and enough wealth to feed a small country, Margaret would make a decision that would shock not only her emotionally distant husband, but the entire social circle that had come to see her as merely decorative. Sometimes the quietest people hold the loudest truths, and sometimes love requires the courage to demand what you deserve, or walk away from everything you've built. Margaret stood before the full-length mirror in their penthouse suite at the Burj Al Arab, adjusting the emerald green evening gown that Rashid's stylist had selected for tonight's celebration. The color brought out the silver in her carefully styled hair, and the designer had tailored the dress to flatter her 62-year-old figure without trying to disguise it. She looked elegant, dignified, and utterly alone. Through the reflection, she could see Rashid across the room, speaking rapid Arabic into his phone, his back turned to her, as it so often was these days. His custom tuxedo fit him perfectly, emphasizing the athletic build he maintained despite being 65. Silver streaked his thick black hair, giving him a distinguished appearance that made heads turn wherever they went. But when was the last time he'd actually looked at her? Really looked at her with the warmth she'd seen in his eyes during their courtship? When was the last time they'd had a conversation that wasn't about his schedule or her duties as his wife? The wedding below would be attended by over 1,000 guests, a spectacle of wealth and tradition that would be photographed for society pages across the Middle East. She would stand beside Rashid, smile for cameras, and play her part in the performance of their marriage. But something inside her was breaking, had been breaking for months, and tonight it felt close to shattering completely. She remembered the woman she'd been before Rashid entered her life, head librarian at Portland's Central Library, content in her small apartment with her books and her garden, her grown children visiting for Sunday dinners. She'd been a widow for 5 years when Rashid had walked into her library during a business trip to Portland, looking for a rare book on Pacific Northwest architecture. Their conversation had lasted 3 hours, stretching through her lunch break and beyond. He'd been charming, intellectually curious, genuinely interested in her thoughts on everything from literature to urban development. When he'd asked her to dinner, she'd said yes, despite her reservations about the obvious differences between them. Their courtship had been like something from a romance novel. Flowers delivered to the library, weekend trips to Seattle and San Francisco, long phone calls when he returned to Dubai. He'd seemed fascinated by her intelligence, her independence, her American directness. He'd asked her to marry him after 6 months, promising her adventure, partnership, and a love that would honor both their maturity and their different worlds. She'd left everything familiar, her job, her apartment, her country, to become Mrs. Rashid Al-Mansouri. For the first year, it had been wonderful, but slowly, imperceptibly at first, she'd felt him withdrawing. Business had always demanded more attention. Social obligations had expanded, and somewhere along the way, she'd become just another beautiful thing in his collection of beautiful things. "Margaret, we need to leave in 10 minutes, Rashid said in English, finally ending his call. His accent, which she'd once found charming, now seemed like just another reminder of the cultural distance between them. "My mother will be expecting us at the family table. Please remember to greet my Uncle Khalil first. He's very traditional about respect protocols." He didn't compliment her appearance, didn't ask if she was ready or if she needed anything, just instructions, as if she were staff rather than his wife. Margaret felt something harden inside her chest, a protective shell forming around her bruised heart. She turned from the mirror, meeting his eyes for perhaps the first time in weeks. "Rashid, do you even see me anymore?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with all the conversations they hadn't had, all the loneliness she'd swallowed, all the diminishing of herself she'd accepted. He looked startled, as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "What? Margaret, this isn't the time. We have a wedding to attend. My family is waiting." Of course they were. His family was always waiting. His business associates were always waiting. The world was always waiting. But when did anyone wait for her? When did her feelings become the priority? She picked up her evening clutch, her hands steady despite the trembling in her soul. "You're right. Let's not keep them waiting." But as they left the suite, she made a decision. Tonight would be different. Tonight, she would stop disappearing. The wedding venue transformed the already opulent Dubai Palace Hotel into something from Arabian Nights fantasies. White roses and orchids cascaded from towering arrangements, their fragrance mingling with expensive perfumes and oud incense. Crystal and gold adorned every surface, catching light from 1,000 candles and reflecting it back in dazzling patterns. The bride's entrance would be legendary. Her dress alone had cost more than most houses, custom designed in Paris with enough crystals to require structural engineering. Margaret followed Rashid through the crowd, watching him transform into his public persona. The charming billionaire, the generous uncle, the pillar of Dubai's business community. He shook hands, embraced old friends, laughed at jokes she couldn't understand in rapid Arabic. She smiled beside him, nodded politely, and felt herself becoming more transparent with each passing moment. This was her life now, standing beside him while he lived his. She'd given up everything she was to become someone who simply took up space in his world. The realization sat in her stomach like a stone, cold and undeniable. Rashid's mother, Fatima Al-Mansouri, sat at the family table surrounded by daughters, nieces and sisters-in-law, a matriarch in traditional dress that probably cost more than Margaret's first car. At 78, she remained formidable, her dark eyes missing nothing despite the cataracts she refused to have treated. She'd never warmed to Margaret, viewing her American daughter-in-law as an exotic trophy her son had acquired rather than a true addition to the family. "Ah, the American wife," she said in careful English as they approached, her tone making it clear this was not a compliment. "You look very green tonight, like a palm tree in the desert, out of place but trying hard to belong." The other women at the table tittered, and Margaret felt the familiar burn of humiliation. Rashid said nothing to defend her, merely helped his mother adjust her shawl with tender attention he never showed his wife anymore. Margaret took her assigned seat and wondered how much more of this she could endure, how many more nights of being the punchline to jokes she wasn't supposed to understand, how many more evenings of watching her husband lavish attention on everyone except her. The ceremony began with traditional Emirati music, the bride's entrance a spectacle of choreographed perfection. Margaret watched the young couple, Rashid's nephew Ahmed and his 25-year-old bride Noura, exchange vows with stars in their eyes. Had she and Rashid ever looked at each other like that? She thought they had, those first magical months. But maybe she'd been fooling herself. Maybe he'd never seen her as anything more than an interesting diversion, an American novelty to add sophistication to his international image. The thought was bitter, but she was tired of sugarcoating her reality. Around her, Rashid's family celebrated with abandon, but he remained glued to his phone, texting someone about a property deal in London that apparently couldn't wait even during his nephew's wedding. He didn't notice when she excused herself from the table. He didn't notice when she walked away toward the terrace overlooking Dubai's glittering skyline. She suspected if she disappeared entirely, it might take him hours to realize she was gone. That's when she saw him, an older gentleman standing alone on the terrace, looking out at the lights with an expression of gentle melancholy that mirrored her own. He turned as she approached, and his weathered face broke into a kind smile. "Seeking refuge from the festivities?" he asked in perfect English with a British accent. "Sometimes the happiest occasions remind us most." sharply of our own sorrows. I'm Dr. William Carrington, old friend of the groom's family, and you are clearly someone who needs to talk. Margaret found herself pouring out her heart to this stranger on the terrace, something about his grandfatherly warmth and genuinely interested eyes, unlocking 3 years of suppressed pain. Dr. Carrington listened without judgment as she described her invisible marriage, her transformation from independent woman to ornamental wife, her growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake in thinking love could bridge such enormous cultural and personal differences. I left everything, she said, her voice cracking despite her attempts at composure. My career, my children, my friends, my country. I learned Arabic, I studied Islam, I adapted every part of myself to fit into his world, and somehow I still don't fit. I'm just decorative, beautiful enough to have on his arm, educated enough not to embarrass him at international dinners, but not real enough to actually matter to him anymore. The admission hung in the desert air between them, heavy with truth she'd been afraid to speak aloud even to herself. Dr. Carrington patted her hand with the gentle touch of someone accustomed to comforting the suffering. My dear, I've been a psychiatrist for 40 years, specializing in cross-cultural relationships and expatriate mental health, and I can tell you with certainty, you are not the problem. Here, you've done everything right. It's your husband who's failing at marriage. The validation hit her like a physical force. Tears she'd been holding back for months, suddenly streaming down her carefully made-up face. Then what do I do? I'm 62 years old in a foreign country, married to a man who doesn't see me anymore. I have no job, no independent income beyond what he provides. If I leave, I have nothing. I gave up my pension when I resigned from the library. My apartment is long sold. My children have their own lives back in Oregon. I'd be starting over with nothing at an age when most people are settling into retirement. But I'm so lonely, I can barely breathe sometimes. Dr. Carrington handed her his handkerchief, monogrammed linen that smelled of expensive cologne and old-world courtesy. You have yourself, he said firmly. You have your intelligence, your education, your resilience. These things don't disappear because you've been made to feel small, and you have choices even if they seem impossible right now. But before you make any decisions, you need to know something. Your husband's behavior isn't about you. It's about him, his culture's expectations of marriage, and quite possibly his own fears about aging and vulnerability. Men like Rashid often build walls around themselves, confusing power with connection, control with love. They talked for nearly an hour, Dr. Carrington offering perspectives that illuminated painful truths Margaret had been avoiding. He explained the psychological dynamics common in marriages where one partner holds all the financial and cultural power, how emotional neglect can be as damaging as outright cruelty, how women Margaret's age often found themselves trapped between societies, no longer belonging to the world they left, never quite accepted in the world they joined. But he also reminded her of something she'd forgotten. She was not powerless. She had dignity. She had worth. She had the right to demand better treatment, even, especially, from someone who claimed to love her. The question isn't whether you can survive leaving, Dr. Carrington said gently. The question is whether you can survive staying in a relationship that diminishes you every single day. That's not living, my dear. That's just existing. And at our age, we don't have time to waste on just existing. The wedding celebration continued behind them, 1,000 people celebrating love, while Margaret confronted the possible end of her own. When she finally returned to the ballroom, her eyes were clear despite being red-rimmed, her spine straighter than it had been in months. She had decisions to make, but first, she had something to say. Rashid didn't notice her return at first, still absorbed in his phone conversation, but his mother did. Fatima's sharp eyes took in Margaret's tear-stained face, and something flickered across her features. Was it satisfaction at seeing the American wife finally cracking, or perhaps the tiniest hint of concern? Margaret couldn't tell, and realized she no longer cared. She was done performing for this family, done trying to win acceptance from people who would never see her as anything but an outsider, done shrinking herself to fit into boxes designed to contain her. The band shifted to a slower tempo, and couples moved onto the dance floor, the bride and groom swaying together in newlywed bliss that seemed to mock Margaret's marital reality. Rashid finally ended his call, slipping his phone into his pocket with a satisfied expression. That was London. The Mayfair property deal is finally moving forward. This could expand our European portfolio significantly. He was telling her about business, as if she were a colleague, not his wife. As if this wedding, this celebration of love and commitment, was just another networking opportunity. Rashid, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady, despite the hammering of her heart. We need to talk, now. He looked at her properly for the first time that evening, seeming to finally register her emotional state. Margaret, you look upset. Did my mother say something? You know how she can be, but she means well. You're just too sensitive sometimes about these cultural differences. Too sensitive. The dismissal was automatic, reflexive, and it crystallized everything Dr. Carrington had helped her understand. She wasn't too sensitive. She was married to a man who had become emotionally unavailable, who hid behind culture and business to avoid genuine intimacy, who had allowed their marriage to become a hollow performance. I'm not too sensitive, Rashid. I'm not sensitive enough. I've been letting you treat me like furniture for 3 years, and I'm done. We can discuss this here, in front of your entire family, or we can go somewhere private. But we are having this conversation tonight. The steel in her voice seemed to shock him. His eyes widened slightly, uncertainty crossing his usually confident features. Around them, family members were beginning to notice the tension, conversations dropping to whispers as people sensed drama unfolding. Rashid's jaw tightened, his pride clearly warring with his desire to avoid a scene. This is neither the time nor the place, Margaret. My nephew's wedding is not about us. Can't this wait until we're home? She almost laughed at the word home. Their penthouse had never felt like home, just a luxurious prison where she performed the role of devoted wife. No, it can't wait, because if we go back to that penthouse tonight with nothing changed, I won't be going with you. I'll be finding a hotel, calling my daughter in Oregon, and starting the process of ending this marriage. So you can give me 5 minutes of genuine attention now, or you can give your lawyer all the time in the world later. Your choice. The ultimatum hung between them, shocking in its directness. Margaret could see his mind working, calculating whether she was bluffing, weighing the embarrassment of indulging her against the potential scandal of their marriage, visibly crumbling at a family event. Finally, he took her elbow, not gently but firmly, and steered her toward a private salon off the main ballroom. 5 minutes, he said tersely, closing the door behind them. Then we're going back to the wedding like nothing happened. She turned to face him in the ornate room, surrounded by more evidence of wealth that meant nothing when your heart was empty. That's exactly the problem, Rashid. We've been pretending nothing's happening for 3 years, but everything is happening. Our marriage is dying. I'm dying inside this marriage. And you don't even notice because you stopped looking at me months ago, maybe years ago. When did you stop seeing me as a person and start seeing me as just another possession? Rashid's face flushed with anger, his carefully maintained composure cracking. That's ridiculous, Margaret. I've given you everything, a lifestyle most women would kill for, access to society, opportunities to travel, financial security you never had as a librarian. How dare you suggest I don't value you? His voice was low but intense, and for the first time in months, she had his complete attention, even if it was fueled by indignation rather than love. But she wasn't backing down. Not now, not when she'd finally found the courage to speak her truth. You've given me things, Rashid. Beautiful, expensive, hollow things. But you haven't given me yourself. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When did you last ask about my thoughts, my feelings, my dreams? When did you last make love to me like I was a woman you desired, not just a duty to be checked off your list? The personal nature of her questions seemed to shock him, his traditional upbringing, clashing with her American directness. In his world, such intimate matters weren't discussed so openly, even between spouses, but she was past caring about his comfort with her honesty. You knew what kind of marriage this would be when you agreed to marry me, Rashid shot back, his accent thickening with emotion. I was clear about my responsibilities, my position in society, the demands of my business. You accepted all of this. You said you understood the cultural differences, that you could adapt. Now you're changing the terms. Margaret felt something break inside her, not her spirit this time, but the last fragile thread of hope that had kept her trying to make this work. I adapted, Rashid. I adapted so much I don't recognize myself anymore. I learned your language. I studied your culture. I shaped myself into what I thought you needed. But adaptation is supposed to go both ways. You've adapted nothing. You expect me to orbit your world while you remain fixed. At the center, unmoved and unmovable. That's not a marriage. That's ownership. And I'm not a possession, no matter how many diamonds you drape around my neck. Her words seemed to hit him physically, his body jerking back slightly as if struck. For a moment she saw something flicker in his eyes, pain perhaps, or recognition, or maybe just wounded pride. You have no idea what you're asking me to give up, he said quietly, his voice losing its anger and taking on something that sounded almost like desperation. My family, my community, they have expectations. I can't just abandon centuries of tradition because my American wife wants more emotional intimacy. That's not how our world works. Then your world is broken, Margaret said simply, and the truth of it settled over them both like dust. Any world that teaches men to hide from emotion, to equate vulnerability with weakness, to value pride over connection, that world is broken. And I can't fix it, Rashid. I can't fix you. I can only decide whether I'm willing to continue breaking myself trying. The silence that followed was heavy, with all the things they'd never said to each other, all the small moments of disconnection that had accumulated into this chasm between them. Outside the salon, the wedding celebration continued. Music, laughter, the sound of joy they were no longer part of. Margaret watched her husband's face, saw him struggling with concepts that challenged everything he'd been. Taught about masculinity, marriage, and what a man owed his wife beyond financial provision. She wondered if he was capable of the transformation that would be required to save their marriage. More importantly, she wondered if she even wanted him to try, or if she'd already grieved this relationship and was ready to let it die. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, and the vulnerability in his voice was so unfamiliar it was almost painful to hear. "Do you want me to stand here and promise to change? To tell you I'll suddenly become some Western ideal of an emotionally available husband? I am who I am, Margaret. I thought you loved who I am." "I loved who you showed me you could be," Margaret answered, her own voice softening, despite the steel in her resolve. "During our courtship you were engaged, present, interested in me as a person. You asked questions. You listened to my answers. You made me feel seen, valued, cherished. That man, I loved him desperately, but that man disappeared after we married, replaced by this distant stranger who treats me like elegant wallpaper. So, which is the real you, Rashid? The man who wooed me, or the man who ignores me?" The question hung between them, cutting through his defenses in a way her anger hadn't. She saw him struggling, his jaw working as he processed her words. For the first time she wondered if maybe he was suffering too, trapped in expectations and roles that allowed him no room to be vulnerable, to admit need, to show the softness that might live beneath all that carefully maintained power. Maybe his culture hadn't just taught him to treat women as decorative. Maybe it had taught him to treat himself as invulnerable, to equate emotion with weakness, to build walls so high that connection became impossible even when he might desperately want it. "I don't know how to be what you need," Rashid admitted, and the confession seemed torn from somewhere deep inside him. "My father taught me that a man provides for his family, protects them, builds a legacy for them. Emotion, intimacy, these were women's concerns, not mine. Love was shown through provision, security, status. I've given you all of those things. I thought it was enough. I thought you understood that this was how I show love. Through the life I've built for you, the position I've given you, the comfort you enjoy." His honesty was painful in its limitations, showing her exactly how vast the gulf between them really was. He genuinely believed that money and status equaled love, that providing materially absolved him of the need to provide emotionally, that a gilded cage was generous as long as the gilding was expensive enough, and she realized with sudden clarity that this wasn't entirely his fault. He'd been shaped by a culture that taught men to be providers rather than partners, to lead rather than listen, to command rather than collaborate. But understanding the source of his emotional unavailability didn't obligate her to continue suffering from it. "Rashid," she said gently, feeling her anger transform into something more like grief, "what you've described isn't love. It's a business transaction. You provide goods and services, money, status, security, and I provide what? Decoration, social acceptability, arm candy for your business events? That's not a marriage. That's employment. And I don't want to be employed by my husband. I want to be loved by him. And if you don't know how to do that, if your upbringing didn't teach you that emotional intimacy is part of love, then we have a serious problem." She watched tears form in his eyes, the first time she'd seen him cry in their entire relationship. He blinked them back furiously, his pride even now refusing to let them fall. "I do love you," he said hoarsely, "but I don't know how to show it the way you need, and I'm terrified that no matter what I do, it won't be enough, that I'll try to change and fail, and you'll leave anyway, that I'll open myself up and you'll use it against me. My mother always said Western women were untrustworthy, that they would take advantage of any weakness. I didn't believe her when I married you, but now I wonder if she was right, if this whole conversation is just manipulation to gain some kind of power over me." The accusation stung, but Margaret recognized it for what it was: fear masquerading as attack, vulnerability, dressed up as anger. This was what happened when people who'd never been taught to process emotion were finally forced to feel something. They lashed out, they blamed, they twisted genuine pain into weapons against the person who'd triggered it. But she was done being his emotional punching bag. "If that's what you truly believe," Margaret said quietly, "then we have nothing more to discuss. I can't build intimacy with someone who sees my need for connection as manipulation. I can't love someone who interprets my pain as a power play. If after 3 years of marriage you still think I'm some kind of gold digger who's trying to take advantage of you, then you never really knew me at all." She turned toward the door, ready to walk away from him, from this marriage, from everything she'd tried to build in this foreign land. But his hand caught her wrist, not roughly, but desperately, the grip of a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. "Wait, please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I'm frightened, Margaret. I'm 65 years old, and I'm frightened like a child. I don't know how to do this. This emotional honesty, this vulnerability, it feels like dying, like losing everything I've built my identity around." She turned back to face him, seeing past the billionaire, past the powerful businessman, past the cultural armor, to the scared human underneath. "It does feel like dying," she agreed softly, "because parts of who we've been have to die for us to become who we need to be. The invulnerable strong man you've played for 65 years, he has to die so that the real Rashid, the one capable of connection and intimacy, can live. And the accommodating people-pleaser I've been for 3 years, she has to die so I can remember how to value myself. We're both going to have to grieve who we've been if we want any chance at becoming who we could be together." He pulled her closer, not into an embrace, but into proximity. Their faces inches apart in the ornate salon, while 1,000 people celebrated love outside. "I don't know if I can do what you're asking," he said honestly. "I don't know if I have it in me to unlearn 65 years of conditioning, but I know I don't want to lose you. Not like this, not with you believing I don't value you, that I never saw you. Because I do see you, Margaret. You're the most remarkable woman I've ever known. You terrify me because you see through all my defenses. You make me feel exposed and vulnerable and weak, and I've spent my whole life avoiding those feelings. But maybe that's exactly what I need." The admission cost him something she could see in his face, a cracking of the facade that had protected him for decades. Margaret felt her own defenses wavering, the part of her that wanted to believe him warring with the part that knew words were easy while change was hard. I need more than words, Rashid. I need action. I need you to actually show up for our marriage instead of just financially supporting it. I need you to look at me like I matter, talk to me like my thoughts are valuable, make love to me like I'm a woman you desire and not just a marital obligation. I need you to defend me when your mother makes cruel comments. I need you to put down your phone during dinner. I need you to ask me how I'm feeling and actually listen to the answer. Can you do those things? Not just tonight, not just while you're scared of losing me, but consistently, permanently as a new way of being? She was laying out the terms of their potential reconciliation with the same clarity she'd once used to explain library cataloging systems to confused patrons. If they were going to rebuild, it needed to be on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine intimacy, not just temporary promises made in crisis. Rashid released her wrist, but kept his eyes locked on hers, and she saw him making calculations. Not business calculations this time, but soul calculations, weighing what he stood to lose against what he'd have to sacrifice to keep it. I can try, he said finally. I can't promise I'll be perfect. I can't promise I won't fall back into old patterns, but I can promise I'll try, and I can promise that when I fail, because I will fail, I won't hide from it or blame you for expecting better. I'll keep trying. It wasn't a grand romantic declaration, but there was something honest in it that touched her more than poetry would have. This was a man who'd spent his life having everything come easy: money, power, social position, finally confronting something that couldn't be purchased or commanded into existence. Emotional intimacy required vulnerability, and vulnerability required trust, and trust had to be earned through consistent action over time. He was offering to do the work, which was more than she'd expected even an hour ago. But was it enough? Could people really change this late in life, or were their patterns too deeply ingrained? And even if he could change, did she want to stay and wait to see if he would, or had too much damage already been done? I need proof, Margaret said, and she saw him flinch slightly at her lack of immediate forgiveness. I need to see actual change, not just hear promises about it. Starting tonight, right now, we're going to go back to that wedding, and you're going to treat me like I matter. You're going to introduce me to people as your brilliant wife who used to run a major library system, not just as Margaret. You're going to dance with me, hold my hand, engage me in conversation. You're going to put your phone away and give me your attention. And when your mother makes a snide comment, you're going to politely but firmly shut it down instead of pretending you didn't hear it. Can you do that? She was testing him, and they both knew it, but she needed to know if his promises had any substance, or if this was just damage control to get her back under management. Rashid straightened his shoulders, and she saw something shift in his posture, less defensive, more determined. Yes, I can do that, and I will, starting now. He offered his arm, not perfunctorily but genuinely, like he had during their courtship. May I have the honor of escorting my remarkable wife back to the celebration? I believe I owe her a dance. Several dances, in fact. The gesture was small, but it was something. Margaret took his arm, feeling the familiar warmth of his body close to hers for the first time in months. They walked back into the ballroom together, and she could feel the shift in him, the intentionality in how he held himself beside her. When they reached their table, Fatima looked up with her usual sour expression, ready to deliver another cutting remark. Ah, you've returned. I was just telling everyone how American women always need so much attention, always causing drama at important family. Mother, Rashid interrupted firmly, his voice respectful but uncompromising. I need you to stop making unkind comments about my wife. Margaret has been nothing but gracious and patient with our family's adjustment period, and she deserves your respect, not your criticism. She's part of this family now, and I expect you to treat her accordingly. The table fell silent, several relatives gasping at Rashid's unprecedented public correction of his mother. Fatima's face darkened with fury, but Margaret saw something else flash in her eyes too, grudging respect, perhaps, or recognition that the American wife might not be as weak as she'd assumed. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Fatima finally nodded curtly, her pride clearly wounded, but her son's authority acknowledged. As you wish. she said stiffly, then turned her attention to her plate, effectively ending the confrontation, but not forgiving it. The other women at the table exchanged glances, and Margaret knew this moment would be discussed in family circles for months. But Rashid had kept his first promise. He'd defended her publicly, chosen her over family politics, drawn a line he'd never drawn before. It was terrifying in its newness, exhilarating in its implications. Maybe he really could change. Maybe they really could build something better from the ashes of what their marriage had become. Or maybe this was just a temporary performance, and tomorrow he'd revert to form, leaving her more disappointed than ever. Time would tell, but for now she had this moment, this public declaration that she mattered. Rashid led her to the dance floor as a slow song began, drawing her into his arms with a tenderness she'd almost forgotten he possessed. They swayed together, and she could feel him trying, really trying, to be present, to connect, to show her through touch what he still struggled to express in words. "I'm sorry," he murmured, against her hair, speaking English so only she would understand. "I'm sorry for making you feel invisible. I'm sorry for taking you for granted. I'm sorry for being so terrible at this part of being human. My father used to say that emotions were the enemy of rational thought, that successful men governed themselves through logic and discipline. I've spent my whole life trying to live up to that impossible standard, trying to be the man he wanted me to be. But I think maybe he was wrong. Maybe emotions aren't the enemy. Maybe cutting ourselves off from feeling is what makes us less than fully human." The admission was profound, coming from a man who'd been raised to equate feeling with weakness. Margaret leaned back to look into his face, seeing traces of tears he was no longer bothering to hide. "Your father was trying to protect you from being hurt," she said gently, "but instead he taught you to hurt yourself by denying huge parts of your own humanity. And then you ended up hurting me by doing the same thing. But we can unlearn this, Rashid. We can teach each other a different way. I can show you that vulnerability isn't weakness, and you can show me that security doesn't have to mean suffocation. We can build something new together if we're both willing to do the work." He pulled her closer, and for the first time in their marriage, she felt him truly let her in. Not just physically, but emotionally, the walls between them thinning, if not yet fully demolished. They danced through 3 songs, lost in their own world, while around them the wedding celebration continued. When they finally returned to their table, Rashid kept his hand in hers, an unprecedented public display of affection from a man who'd been taught that such gestures were inappropriate between spouses in social settings. His family noticed, his business associates noticed, everyone noticed, and Margaret realized that this was his way of making a statement, not with grand words but through action, showing his world that his priorities were shifting, that his wife was no longer just decorative but central to his life. Dr. Carrington caught her eye from across the room and gave her a small, knowing smile. He'd witnessed her transformation from defeated wife to woman, reclaiming her power, and his approval warmed her. Later, during a break in the music, Rashid surprised her by asking, "Tell me about the library. Your work before you married me. I don't think I ever really understood what you did, what it meant to you. I'd like to understand now, if you'll tell me." The request was simple but revolutionary. Him asking to know her, to understand her history, to value her identity beyond her role as his wife. Margaret felt emotion swell in her chest as she began describing her 23 years as a librarian, the progression from children's programming coordinator to head librarian at Portland's Central Library, the initiatives she'd championed to bring digital resources to underserved communities, the literacy programs she'd developed for immigrant populations, the joy of connecting people with exactly the right book at exactly the right moment in their lives. She spoke about the architecture of the library building itself, the smell of old books mixed with new, the quiet sanctuary it provided in a noisy world, the community it fostered among people from all walks of life. As she talked, she watched Rashid's face transform with genuine interest, and she realized he was learning about her for the first time, discovering depths he'd never bothered to explore during their courtship or marriage. He'd fallen in love with a surface version of her, intelligent, well-read, interesting, but he'd never dug deeper to understand what actually gave her life meaning, what she'd sacrificed when she left Portland, what she'd lost when she became Mrs. Al-Mansouri. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" he asked, looking pained by the realization of how little he'd actually known his own wife. "Why didn't I ask before?" "I tried to tell you," Margaret admitted. "In the beginning, I would share stories from my work, talk about programs I was developing, ask your thoughts on library funding challenges. But you always seemed distracted, or you'd redirect the conversation to your business deals, or you'd glaze over with that polite but bored expression I came to recognize. Eventually, I stopped trying. I learned to talk only about things you found interesting, to shape conversations around your world instead of mine. I shrunk my whole existence down to fit into the margins of your life, and I'm not blameless in that. I allowed it to happen. I convinced myself that being loved by you required not taking up too much space, not demanding too much attention, not being too much. But I was wrong. Love shouldn't require you to diminish yourself. Real love makes room for both people to be fully themselves." Rashid winced at her words, understanding for perhaps the first time the costs of his emotional neglect. "I want to know everything," he said urgently, "not just about the library, but about you, your childhood, your first marriage, your children, your dreams that had nothing to do with me. I want to know what makes you laugh, what makes you cry, what you think about when you wake up at 3 in the morning. I want to know the real Margaret Sullivan, not just the woman who agreed to become Margaret Al-Mansouri." The conversation continued through dinner, Rashid asking questions and actually listening to her answers, engaging with her thoughts instead of waiting for his turn to speak. His family noticed the shift, the intensity with which he focused on his wife instead of his phone, and Margaret saw confusion on many faces. This wasn't the Rashid they knew, the man who treated family gatherings as networking opportunities, and his wife as attractive furniture. When the evening's formal program ended and the party shifted to more casual celebration, Rashid surprised her again by introducing her to his uncle Khalil, the family patriarch and traditional elder who'd barely acknowledged her existence in 3 years. "Uncle, I'd like you to meet my wife Margaret properly, not just as my American bride, but as the woman she is. She ran one of the largest library systems in the Pacific Northwest for over 2 decades, served on multiple literacy boards, and developed programs that brought reading to thousands of children from immigrant families. She speaks 5 languages. Did you know that? English, French, Spanish, Arabic, and she's been teaching herself Farsi. She has a master's degree in library science and another in education administration. She's brilliant, accomplished, and I've been a fool not to tell everyone this from the beginning." Uncle Khalil's eyebrows rose, his weathered face registering surprise as he looked at Margaret with new eyes, seeing her suddenly as a person with accomplishments rather than just his nephew's foreign wife. 5 languages?" he asked in careful English, "including Farsi?" "Why Farsi?" Margaret smiled, feeling valued for the first time in this family circle. "Because I wanted to read Rumi in the original language," she explained. "I studied his poetry and English translations during my library years, used his words in programming for adults learning to read, but I always felt translation couldn't capture the full beauty of his verse, so I decided to learn Farsi myself. I'm not fluent yet, but I'm working on it." Something shifted in Khalil's expression, the traditional patriarch recognizing a kindred spirit who valued the cultural treasures of the Persian Arab world enough to dedicate herself to understanding them in their original form. "Rumi," he said thoughtfully, "a wise choice. His words about love transcend all barriers. Perhaps you would recite something for me in Farsi." It was a test, Margaret knew, but also an invitation to prove herself worthy of respect in his eyes. She took a breath and recited one of her favorite verses, her pronunciation imperfect but earnest. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right-doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. The traditional elder's face softened, genuine pleasure, replacing his earlier skepticism. Your accent needs work, he said gruffly, but your understanding of the poetry is sound. Any woman who reads Rumi and Farsi is welcome in this family. He turned to Rashid with a stern expression. You've kept this treasure hidden, nephew. Why? Afraid we would steal her from you. It was said partly in jest, but there was real criticism beneath the humor. An elder recognizing that Rashid had failed to properly value and showcase his wife's qualities. Rashid had the grace to look embarrassed. I think I was afraid of exactly that, uncle. Afraid that if people knew how remarkable she was, they'd wonder what she was doing with me. The admission was surprisingly vulnerable, and Margaret saw Uncle Khalil's expression shift to something like sympathy. Fear makes fools of us all, especially when it comes to love, the old man said. But recognition comes before transformation. You're beginning to see clearly. Don't stop now, he excused himself to join other family members, leaving Margaret and Rashid alone in the crowd, forever changed by the evening's revelations and confrontations. The rest of the wedding celebration passed in a blur of conversation, dancing, and small moments of connection that felt like rebuilding a bridge between them piece by piece. Rashid introduced her to business associates as his accomplished wife, brought her into conversations about art and architecture where her opinions were actually valued, danced with her 4 more times despite his earlier claims that public displays of affection were inappropriate in their culture. When his mother made another veiled criticism, he shut it down immediately, and when his phone rang during a particularly beautiful musical performance, he sent it to voicemail without hesitation. These were small actions, but they accumulated into a pattern. Him choosing her, prioritizing her, seeing her. It wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes, still defaulted occasionally to old habits, but he caught himself, apologized, corrected course. And Margaret realized she was seeing something she'd thought impossible. A man in his mid-60s, shaped by rigid cultural conditioning and lifelong habits, actually trying to change. The effort itself was a form of love, perhaps more meaningful than easy affection from someone who'd never had to work at connection. As the evening wound down and they finally left the celebration, Margaret felt exhausted but hopeful in ways she hadn't felt in years. In the car back to their penthouse, Rashid kept her hand in his, a gesture so simple yet so significant after 3 years of emotional distance. I spoke with Dr. Carrington before we left, he said quietly. Thanked him for his wisdom in counseling you tonight. He suggested we might benefit from marriage therapy, someone who specializes in cross-cultural relationships, someone who can help us navigate these differences while building stronger intimacy. The fact that Rashid was suggesting therapy, something that would have been unthinkable for a man of his generation and culture just hours ago, showed how serious he was about changing. Margaret squeezed his hand. I think that's a wonderful idea, but we should also be realistic about what therapy can and can't do. It can give us tools and insights, but the actual work of changing, that's on us. That happens in the daily choices, the small moments when we either choose connection or retreat to our separate corners. He nodded, his profile illuminated by the passing lights of Dubai's skyline. I know, and I know I have farther to travel than you do. You've already shown incredible strength and adaptability. I'm the one who needs to grow, to open up, to become someone worthy of you. It's not about worthiness, Margaret corrected gently. It's about partnership, about 2 imperfect people choosing to do the hard work of really knowing each other, really seeing each other, really loving each other beyond the surface. You're worthy of that kind of love, Rashid, but you have to believe you're worthy of it. You have to believe that being vulnerable won't destroy you, that showing emotion won't make you weak, that needing someone doesn't diminish your strength. He pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in his familiar cologne mixed with the desert air filtering through the car's ventilation. My father once told me that the only thing worse than being alone was being weak enough to need someone, Rashid said quietly. I think that poisoned me, made me equate independence with strength and need with failure. But watching Ahmed and Noura tonight, seeing how they look at each other, how they support each other, I realized my father was wrong. The strength isn't in not needing anyone. The strength is in letting yourself need someone and trusting them enough to meet. That need, that's terrifying, but maybe that's the point. Maybe real love should be terrifying because it means giving someone the power to hurt you and trusting they won't use it. The insight showed how much he'd processed in just a few hours, how the confrontation had cracked open something in him that had been sealed for decades. When they reached their building, he surprised her by dismissing the driver and walking her slowly through the lobby, his arm around her waist, not hurrying toward the privacy of their suite, but savoring the journey there together. In the elevator, he turned to her and said, I want to start over, not our marriage. We can't erase 3 years, but I want to start over with how I approach it. I want to court you again, Margaret. Take you on dates, ask you questions, discover who you are today, not just who you were when we met. I want to rebuild what we lost and build new things we never had. Will you give me that chance? Tears filled Margaret's eyes, not tears of sadness this time, but of cautious hope. Yes, she whispered, but Rashid, you have to understand. There will be times when I won't believe the change is real, when I'll pull back, protect myself, wait for you to revert to old patterns. You'll have to be patient with my fear, just as I'm patient with your learning process. Rebuilding trust takes time. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. Then we'll take all the time we need. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not letting you go. Not ever again. When they entered their penthouse, everything looked exactly as it had when they'd left. Expensive furniture, magnificent view, art worth more than most people's houses. But somehow it all felt different now, infused with possibility instead of just opulent emptiness. Rashid surprised her by leading her not to the bedroom but to the balcony, where the lights of Dubai spread out below them like a galaxy of human dreams and ambitions. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind, and they stood together in silence, just being present with each other in a way they hadn't been since the early days of their courtship. Tell me something you've never told me before, he said softly. Something real, something true about who you are underneath all the roles you play. Margaret leaned back against his chest, feeling his heartbeat against her spine, and decided to trust him with a vulnerable truth. I'm terrified of becoming my mother, she admitted. She gave up everything for my father, her career, her friends, her identity, and spent 40 years being his support system while slowly disappearing as a person. When he died, she didn't know who she was without him. She lasted 6 months before a stroke took her, and I always wondered if she just gave up because she'd erased herself so completely that there was nothing left to live for. She felt Rashid's arms tighten around her, his breath warm against her neck. Is that what you thought was happening to you? With us? His voice was thick with emotion. That you were becoming her? Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. I felt myself disappearing the same way, giving up pieces of myself, editing my thoughts, shrinking my presence, becoming whoever I thought you needed me to be instead of who I actually was. And I was so afraid that one day I'd wake up and wouldn't recognize the woman in the mirror, that I'd lose myself completely in being Mrs. Al-Mansouri. That's why tonight felt like life or death to me, because it was the life or death of my soul. Rashid turned her to face him, his own eyes wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. I never wanted that. God, Margaret, I never wanted to erase you. I wanted to build a life with you, not consume your life into mine. But I didn't know how. I only knew the model my father showed me, the patriarch who leads, the wife who follows. I didn't realize that model was broken, that it creates exactly the kind of hollow marriage my parents had. My mother disappeared too, you know. She was this vibrant, intelligent woman before she married my father, and he spent 50 years shrinking her down to what he found comfortable. I swore I wouldn't do that, but I did it anyway because it's all I knew. the recognition that they were both products of damaged models of marriage, both trying to break generational patterns, without quite knowing how, created a new intimacy between them. They weren't just two people from different cultures struggling to connect. They were two people from damaged families, trying to build something healthier than what they'd been shown. "We can break the pattern," Margaret said firmly. "We can be different than our parents were, but it requires choosing differently every single day. It requires you seeing me as a whole person, not just a wife. And it requires me demanding to be seen that way, not settling for less because I'm afraid of being alone. We both have to change, grow, become braver versions of ourselves." Rashid nodded, pulling her into a kiss that held all the tenderness and presence that had been missing from their physical relationship for months. When they finally pulled apart, he said, "No more phones during dinner. No more dismissing your feelings as too sensitive. No more letting my mother's cruelty go unchallenged. No more making you feel invisible. These are my promises to you, starting tomorrow and every day after." Margaret smiled through her tears. "And I promise to tell you when I'm hurt instead of swallowing it, to share my thoughts instead of editing them to make them more palatable, to take up space instead of shrinking, to be myself fully instead of who I think you want me to be. These are my promises to you." They sealed their new commitments with another kiss, and this time Rashid led her to their bedroom with intention and presence she hadn't experienced in their marriage before. He undressed her slowly, not mechanically but reverently, as if discovering her body for the first time. "You're beautiful," he murmured against her skin. "You've always been beautiful, but I stopped telling you, stopped showing you. I took you for granted in every way, including this way. I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for making you feel like our intimacy was just obligation instead of celebration." Margaret felt herself responding to his touch in ways she'd forgotten were possible, her body remembering what it felt like to be desired rather than just accommodated. They made love slowly, connected not just physically but emotionally, and afterward they lay tangled together, talking in the darkness about everything and nothing, dreams, fears, hopes, regrets. This was the intimacy she'd been craving, the true nakedness that went deeper than unclothed bodies to revealed souls. "I want to visit Portland with you," Rashid said suddenly. "I want to see your library, meet your children properly, understand the life you left to be with me. I want to know what I asked you to sacrifice, so I can appreciate what you gave up and never take it for granted again." The suggestion shocked Margaret into sitting up, looking down at his face in the moonlight streaming through their bedroom windows. "You'd do that? Take time away from your business empire to go to Portland, just to understand my old life better?" He pulled her back down beside him, his hand warm on her waist. "My business empire will survive a week without me. It might even improve. My COO has been lobbying for more autonomy. And yes, I'd do that. I need to do that. How can I really know you if I don't understand where you came from, what shaped you, what you gave up to be here with me? I've been asking you to live in my world without making any effort to understand yours. That changes now. Portland first, then maybe we split our time between Dubai and America more evenly. Maybe we establish a second home there. You shouldn't have to give up your whole country to be married to me." Margaret felt her last defenses crumbling, the wall around her heart, built brick by brick through 3 years of disappointment and neglect, beginning to come down. This was real change, evidenced through concrete actions and specific plans, not just beautiful words whispered in the aftermath of crisis. He was showing her he understood that integration went both ways, that she shouldn't be the only one adapting, that real partnership meant both people stretching to meet in the middle. "I love you," she said, and meant it more deeply than she had in months. "I love the man you're becoming, the courage it takes to change this much, this late in life. I know how hard this is for you, unlearning everything you were taught about masculinity and marriage and what it means to be a man. I see your effort, and I honor it, and I love you for it." Rashid kissed her forehead, his beard rough against her skin in a way that had once irritated her but now felt like home. "I love you too, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that love through actions, not just words, starting with marriage therapy. I already called Dr. Carrington and asked for referrals to therapists who specialize in cross-cultural relationships and work with couples our age. He's sending me 3 names tomorrow. We'll interview them together and choose someone who feels right for both of us. The fact that he'd already taken this concrete step, that he wasn't just making promises but implementing plans, filled Margaret with hope she'd thought was lost forever. Maybe their marriage really could transform from its damaged state into something stronger, more authentic, more truly loving than it had ever been. Maybe confrontation, as painful as it was, had been exactly what they needed to break through years of polite distance into genuine connection. They talked until dawn, painted the Dubai sky in shades of pink and gold, making plans for their future that honored both their identities, his as a successful Middle Eastern businessman, hers as an accomplished American woman who'd given up too much of herself. They discussed establishing a foundation focused on literacy programs for immigrant communities, combining his resources with her expertise. They talked about building a house in Portland that would feel like home when they visited, somewhere her children and future grandchildren would want to gather. They planned trips to places she'd always wanted to visit: Paris, Athens, Tokyo, not just tagging along on his business travels, but genuine vacations where they could explore together without the pressure of networking or deal-making. "I want to take a cooking class with you in Italy," Margaret said, surprising herself with the specificity of the dream. "One of those week-long ones where you stay in a villa in Tuscany and learn to make pasta from scratch. I've always wanted to do that, but I never mentioned it because it seemed frivolous compared to your business obligations." Rashid laughed, and she realized how long it had been since she'd heard him laugh with genuine joy rather than social obligation. "Then we'll do it. This fall, before the weather turns, we'll spend a week in Tuscany making terrible a pasta and drinking good wine and having absolutely nothing to do with real estate or social obligations. Just us, learning something new together." The image of them, 2 people in their 60s, covered in flour, laughing over pasta dough, felt revolutionary after 3 years of formal dinners and charity galas where even their private moments felt performative. Margaret snuggled closer to him, feeling exhausted but more awake than she'd been in years. "What made you fall in love with me?" she asked, a question she'd never dared ask before. "Originally, I mean, in Portland, when we first met. What was it about a 60-year-old librarian that caught your attention?" Rashid was quiet for a moment, thinking. "You were reading when I walked into the library," he finally said. "Not working, just reading during your lunch break, some battered paperback mystery. And when I asked you for help, you looked annoyed at first, like I was interrupting something important. But then you smiled and said, 'Let's see what mystery you need solved.' And you took me seriously. You didn't recognize who I was, didn't care about my wealth or status. You just engaged with my question about Pacific Northwest architecture like it was the most interesting problem in the world. You were brilliant and engaged and completely yourself. No performance, no pretense, and I fell in love with that authenticity. The irony is that I then spent 3 years slowly crushing that very authenticity out of you by making you perform for my world. I fell in love with your realness and then made you fake." The recognition of this irony made them both sad, acknowledging the ways they damaged something precious through carelessness and cultural conditioning. But naming it was the first step toward fixing it, and they both seemed to understand that. "We're going to make mistakes," Margaret said softly. "You'll forget and default to old patterns. I'll withdraw to protect myself. We'll hurt each other even when we're trying not to, but if we can stay committed to working through it, to talking honestly instead of silently suffering, to choosing each other every day even when it's hard, then maybe we can build something real, something that honors both of us." Rashid kissed her, sweet and gentle and full of promise. "We will build something real, I promise you that. And I'm going to start by taking you to breakfast. Not the formal dining room with the staff, but that little cafe you love on Jumeirah Beach, where we can sit outside and watch the water and just be a couple having breakfast together. No phones, no business, no performance, just us. The suggestion was so simple yet so radical, representing a complete shift in how he approached their relationship. Margaret felt tears welling up again, overwhelmed by the transformation happening between them, by the hope that maybe, just maybe, they were finally building the marriage they both deserved. Over the following weeks, Margaret watched Rashid work hard at keeping his promises. He started each day by asking how she slept, what she dreamed about, what she was looking forward to in the coming hours. Small questions that showed genuine interest in her inner world. He scheduled marriage therapy twice a week with Dr. Amira Hassan, a Pakistani-British therapist who specialized in cross-cultural relationships and didn't let either of them hide behind excuses or in cultural differences. He put his phone in a drawer during dinner and gave her his full attention. He defended her against his mother's continued barbs with increasing firmness until Fatima finally seemed to accept that her American daughter-in-law was here to stay and deserved respect. He took Margaret to her beloved beach cafe 3 mornings a week, learning to appreciate quiet time together without the pressure of business or social performance. He asked about her library career, really listening this time, and surprised her by funding a new literacy initiative in Portland in her name, the Margaret Sullivan Al-Mansouri Center for Adult Learning, which would provide free reading instruction and GED preparation for immigrant communities. The gift moved her to tears, this tangible recognition of her professional identity beyond being his wife. But the change wasn't linear or easy. There were hard days when old patterns reasserted themselves, when Rashid became absorbed in a crisis at work and reverted to treating Margaret like furniture, or when his fear of vulnerability made him lash out defensively during therapy sessions. There were moments when Margaret's trust failed and she withdrew, protecting herself from anticipated hurt, even when Rashid was genuinely trying to connect. They had fights, real ones with raised voices and hurt feelings, learning how to disagree without destroying each other, how to be angry without being cruel, how to navigate conflict in ways neither had been taught growing up. Dr. Hassan guided them through these rough patches, teaching them communication tools and helping them understand how their respective cultural backgrounds had shaped their expectations and fears around intimacy. She helped Rashid see how his father's emotional unavailability had created deep wounds around vulnerability, and how his culture's emphasis on male stoicism had given him permission to avoid those wounds rather than heal them. She helped Margaret understand how her mother's self-erasure had created fears of losing herself in marriage, and how her accommodating tendencies actually prevented real intimacy by keeping her authentic self hidden. One particularly difficult session came 6 weeks into their therapy journey, when Dr. Hassan asked them to talk about their sex life. Rashid immediately became defensive, arguing that such intimate matters shouldn't be discussed even in therapy, that Western approaches to counseling didn't respect the privacy valued in his culture. That's exactly the problem, Dr. Hassan said gently but firmly. You're using culture as a shield against vulnerability, but sexual intimacy is a crucial part of marital connection. And if we can't talk about it honestly, we can't address the ways it's become another arena where you've emotionally withdrawn from your wife. The confrontation was uncomfortable, but it led to them discussing how their physical relationship had become mechanical, how Rashid had stopped seeing Margaret as a woman he desired and started treating their intimate moments as marital obligation. Margaret admitted she'd stopped initiating sex because his lack of enthusiasm made her feel rejected and undesirable. They both cried during that session, grieving what their physical connection had become, while also opening the door to making it something better. Dr. Hassan gave them specific homework, spending time together without any expectation of sex, just touching and talking and rediscovering each other's bodies as sources of pleasure rather than obligation. The exercises felt awkward at first, but they slowly rekindled something that had gone dormant, reminding them both of the physical chemistry that had first drawn them together. 3 months after the wedding confrontation, Rashid kept his promise to visit Portland. They spent a week in Margaret's hometown, and she watched him see her old life with new eyes. He met her daughter Sarah, a 38-year-old social worker, and her son David, a 40-year-old high school teacher, spending real time getting to know them as people rather than just her children. He visited the Central Library, where her former colleagues gave them a tour and shared stories about Margaret's impact on the community, her innovative programs, her legendary ability to match the right book to the right reader. Rashid listened to them describe his wife's accomplishments with obvious pride and growing understanding of what she'd given up to marry him. He met her book club friends, sat through a 2-hour discussion of contemporary fiction where he was clearly out of his depth but engaged anyway. He let Sarah take him on a tour of the social services programs she ran, learning about poverty and addiction and systemic inequality in ways that challenged his assumptions about American prosperity. He had dinner with David's family, playing board games with Margaret's grandchildren, and seeing her light up in ways he rarely saw in Dubai. "This is who you were before me," he said one night in their hotel room, his voice full of wonder and regret. "This vibrant, connected, purposeful woman with a whole rich life. And I took you away from all this and gave you what? Isolation in a foreign country, a husband who ignored you, a family who resented you. What was I thinking?" Margaret took his hands, moved by his genuine remorse, but also needing him to understand a more complex truth. "You didn't take me away, Rashid. I chose to leave. I chose you, chose adventure, chose love even knowing the risks. Yes, I gave up a lot, but I also gained things. Travel, luxury, experiences I never would have had. The problem wasn't that I left Portland. The problem was that once I left, you didn't help me build a new life in Dubai. You expected me to simply orbit yours without creating anything of my own. That's what made it unbearable. Not the sacrifice itself, but the lack of reciprocity, the one-sidedness of the adaptation." He nodded slowly, understanding. "But now we can change that, not just in how I treat you, but in how we structure our lives. We could spend part of the year here, let you reconnect with your roots, your children, your friends. We could build that foundation we talked about, giving you meaningful work that uses your skills. We could make Portland a genuine second home, not just a place we visit." The suggestion showed how much he'd grown, his willingness to share their life between two cultures rather than expecting her to fully assimilate into his. They spent the rest of the week looking at properties, eventually finding a beautiful craftsman house in the hills overlooking the city, with enough space for family gatherings and a library that made Margaret's heart sing. Before they left Portland, Sarah pulled Margaret aside for a private conversation. "Mum, I have to say, I wasn't sure about Rashid when you first married him. The age difference, the cultural gap, moving so far away, it all worried me. But seeing you two together now, seeing how he looks at you and listens to you and clearly cherishes you, I'm happy for you. Whatever happened to create this change, I'm glad it did. You deserve a partner who sees your value, and it seems like he finally does." Margaret hugged her daughter, grateful for the blessing she hadn't realized she'd needed. "It wasn't easy getting here," she admitted. "We almost didn't make it. I was ready to leave him, actually, but we both chose to do the hard work instead, and I think we're building something stronger than what we had before, something more honest, more equal, more real." Sarah squeezed her mother's hands. "Good, because watching you disappear into that marriage was scary. You're back now, more yourself than I've seen you in years. Don't lose that again." The warning was loving, but firm, and Margaret took it seriously. She'd fought too hard to reclaim herself to ever let anyone, even someone she loved, make her invisible again. Back in Dubai, their transformed marriage became increasingly visible to their social circle. Rashid's business associates noticed how he included Margaret in conversations, valued her opinions, defended her intelligence. His family noticed how he prioritized time with her over endless business obligations, how he'd turned down invitations to exclusive events if Margaret had other plans. Fatima noticed her son's happiness, and while still not warm toward her daughter-in-law, at least stopped the constant criticism. The couple's obvious connection and genuine affection seemed to shift something in their social world. Other wives quietly asking Margaret how she'd managed to transform her marriage. Other husbands watching Rashid with a mix of admiration and concern that perhaps their own wives would demand similar changes. Margaret and Rashid became advocates in their community for healthier marital relationships, speaking at family counseling centers about cross-cultural marriage challenges and the importance of genuine partnership over traditional hierarchy. Dr. Hassan asked them to share their story with other couples she counseled, particularly those struggling with cultural differences and generational patterns of emotional distance. "You too represent hope," she told them. "You show that it's never too late to change, that people in their 60s can unlearn destructive patterns and build something beautiful, that love can grow stronger rather than weaker if both people are willing to do the work." The literacy foundation they established became a passion project for both of them, combining Rashid's business acumen and resources with Margaret's educational expertise and community connections. They traveled together to visit programs in Portland and Dubai, working with immigrant communities to improve access to reading instruction and adult education. Margaret bloomed in this work, her purpose and identity expanding beyond just being Rashid's wife to becoming a recognized advocate for literacy and education. Rashid supported her fully, attending her speaking engagements, bragging about her accomplishments to anyone who would listen, making sure everyone knew that his wife was brilliant and accomplished in her own right. He even convinced her to write a book about adult literacy programs, using his connections to get it published and promoted. When Reading as Liberation, a librarian's guide to adult literacy was published, Rashid threw a launch party that rivaled any of his business celebrations, inviting Dubai's intellectual and philanthropic communities to honor his wife's work. Margaret stood in the center of the celebration, surrounded by people who saw and valued her, with a husband who was genuinely proud rather than just performatively supportive, and felt more herself than she had since leaving Portland. Their sex life also transformed as they continued working through their intimacy issues in therapy. They learned to communicate desires and boundaries, to see their physical connection as pleasure rather than obligation, to enjoy each other's aging bodies without shame or pretense of youth. Rashid learned to be present during lovemaking instead of going through mechanical motions, and Margaret learned to express her needs instead of silently accepting whatever he offered. They laughed more during intimacy, talked more, connected more deeply. They discovered that sex in their 60s could be better than in youth, less performative, more authentic, enriched by emotional intimacy and genuine care for each other's pleasure. One night after particularly satisfying lovemaking, Rashid said, "I used to think sex was about conquest, about proving masculinity, about performance. But this connection, vulnerability, mutual pleasure, this is so much better. I wasted so much time being afraid of real intimacy because I thought it would make me weak. But it actually makes me feel more alive, more myself, more human." Margaret kissed him, grateful for his growth, for his willingness to unlearn toxic lessons about masculinity, for his courage to be vulnerable with her. "This is what love looks like," she said softly. "Not just the grand gestures or expensive gifts, but this willingness to know and be known, to risk and trust, to grow and change. You've given me the greatest gift, the gift of seeing me, really seeing me, and choosing to love what you see." A year after that fateful wedding confrontation, Rashid surprised Margaret with a renewal of their vows, not the enormous spectacle that had been their original wedding, but an intimate ceremony on Jumeirah Beach at sunset, with just their immediate family and closest friends present. This time, they wrote their own vows, speaking honestly about the journey they'd traveled together, the mistakes made, the hurt caused, the healing accomplished, the love deepened through struggle and growth. "I promise to see you every day," Rashid said, his voice thick with emotion as they stood barefoot in the sand. "Not just look at you, but truly see you. Your intelligence, your strength, your beauty, your worth. I promise to listen when you speak, value what you contribute, defend your dignity, and honor your identity beyond your role as my wife. I promise to be vulnerable with you, to share my fears and dreams, to let you know me as I'm learning to know you. I promise to do the hard work of growth, to challenge the destructive patterns I inherited, to become a better man and a better partner. I promise to love you actively, intentionally, daily, not just with words, but with actions that prove you matter more than business, more than status, more than my own comfort. I choose you, Margaret Sullivan Al-Mansouri, every single day, and I will keep choosing you until my last breath." Margaret's vows were equally moving. "I promise to be myself fully in this marriage," she said, tears streaming down her face as she held his hands. "Not a diminished version, not an edited version, but my whole authentic self, opinions and all. I promise to take up space, to speak my truth, to demand to be seen and heard and valued. I promise to trust you with my vulnerability even when it scares me, to believe in your capacity for growth, to celebrate your efforts even when you stumble. I promise to build a life here that honors both my American roots and my Middle Eastern present, to create purpose beyond being your wife, to remain connected to my family and community while also embracing yours. I promise to love you fiercely, but not at the cost of loving myself, to invest in our partnership while maintaining my individual identity. I choose you, Rashid Al-Mansouri, not because I need to be saved or provided for, but because you've proven yourself worthy of my love through your willingness to change, to grow, to do the hard work of becoming a true partner. And I will keep choosing you as long as you keep choosing us." They exchanged new rings, simpler than their original wedding bands, engraved with "I see you" in both English and Arabic, and sealed their renewed commitment with a kiss as the sun set over the Arabian Gulf, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The celebration afterward was small but joyful. Margaret's children had flown in from Portland. Rashid's family attended with genuine warmth now that they'd witnessed the strength of the marriage, and Dr. Hassan was there as an honored guest, having guided them through the transformation that made this renewal possible. Uncle Khalil gave a blessing that acknowledged both cultures, and Fatima even offered a grudging speech about how American daughters-in-law could surprise you if you gave them a chance to prove themselves. Margaret and Rashid danced on the beach as the stars came out, surrounded by people who loved them and believed in their marriage, and both felt the weight of the past year's struggle transform into the lightness of hope and possibility. "We made it," Rashid whispered against her hair as they swayed together. "We could have ended, should have ended probably, given how badly I'd damaged us, but we made it through to something better." Margaret leaned back to look into his face, seeing the man he'd become, more open, more vulnerable, more truly himself than the wealthy businessman facade he'd worn for so long. "We made it because we both chose to fight for us instead of against each other," she said, "and we'll keep making it as long as we keep choosing love over pride, connection over performance, growth over comfort." They continued dancing long after the music stopped, two people in their 60s who'd faced the end of their marriage and chosen instead to begin again, proving that it's never too late to change, never too late to grow, and never too late to build the love you actually deserve. Their story became legendary in their social circles. The billionaire who learned to see his wife, the librarian who refused to disappear, the marriage that almost ended but instead transformed into something more beautiful than either had imagined possible. And when people asked them the secret to their success, they always gave the same answer: honest communication, willingness to be vulnerable, commitment to growth, and the courage to demand better from yourself, from your partner, and from your marriage. Love, they learned, wasn't just a feeling. It was a practice, a choice, a daily renewal of commitment to seeing and being seen, knowing and being known, loving and being loved in return. And that practice, that choice, that commitment, that was worth fighting for. That was worth everything.